The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I'll be splitting my time with the member from Victoria. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to rise today and speak in response to the budget introduced by the government in this House last week. Over the last 4 years as a member of Parliament, I've learned one thing for sure. The Conservatives and this Prime Minister aren't nearly the economic managers they seem to think they are. In fact, time and time again, this government shows precisely the opposite. They show us and Canadians just how incompetent as managers of the economy they can be. This is a government that has dropped the ball on so many incredible, important files. We just have to look at the F-35, Mr. Speaker. They must have good supply of pixie dust to use on unsuspecting Canadians if they think they can pass this budget off as sound economic planning. And of course, this is backstopped by at least a $13 million advertising budget of Canadians' money they're going to spend on propelling themselves into the election, Mr. Speaker. Now, I had to laugh last week when my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley said in his response to the budget, they spent the surplus before they had it. Then they panicked. They didn't know what to do because the economy was not performing the way they had hoped. One would think that planning more than praying would be the norm within the Finance Department, but not under this government. My esteemed colleague could not have been more correct. Mr. Speaker, how else do we explain a budget that is predicted on such a shallow set of priorities and planning principles with so little regard for thinking things through? How else can one explain draining the contingency fund so that in the short term it looks like we not in a deficit, Mr. Speaker? And of course, from dropping that from $3 billion to $1 billion, that means that any unforeseen event that could take place would actually bring the government back into the red. And we just have to look last year at some of the events that happened. We had the ice storm in Toronto. We had tremendous flooding in Alberta. We also had flooding in Toronto and other weather events, Mr. Speaker, that cost the economy and certainly cost the provinces and the federal government billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. And those contingency funds are there for good reasons, to protect against those unforeseen events. Now, we also saw the fire sale of our government interest in General Motors. Now, of course, we all understand that the government was not supposed to hold on to these shares in perpetuity, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, one of the simple staples of investment and having stocks, Mr. Speaker, is you try to buy low and then you sell high. Well, Mr. Speaker, what the government has done in selling the shares at this time is actually costing $3.5 billion. So they sold it at a net loss of $3.5 billion. That's as if every single Canadian across the country had a $100 bill to begin with, took it out of their pocket and set it on fire, Mr. Speaker. That's $100 for every Canadian that this government has gone and wasted in order to be able to say that they had a balanced budget. So these things are very questionable, and not just in my opinion, but in the opinion of many economists on both sides of the political spectrum. But much more importantly, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the changes, of course, that the government has made to the tax-free savings accounts, because these changes really represent just how cynical and crass this government can be and how shallow and short-sighted their economic policy really is. So the Conservatives are going to change the maximum allowable contributions for TFSAs up to $10,000 a year. Well, who does this help? Of course, and we've heard from the government that millions of Canadians have TFSAs. Yes, 11 million. But guess what? Only 11% of those people deposited the maximum last year. Mr. Speaker, only 11%. So 90% of the people depositing in there already don't have enough to deposit the current maximum, but they want to double it, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because it's going to help their well-heeled friends. So it's not going to help the majority of the working class and the middle class people that I work for in my riding of Scarborough Southwest. These people don't seem to find themselves burdened at the end of the year with having to decide what to do with an extra $10,000 that's burning a hole in their pocket. I wish I could say that they did, Mr. Speaker, because Scarborough used to be a prosperous place. It used to have above national average incomes. It used to have tens of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs that help to actually elevate people into the middle class, Mr. Speaker. But through successive Liberal and Conservative governments ever since first free trade and then NAFTA came in, Mr. Speaker, all of that industry and all of those good-paying jobs left. We used to have a GM van plant in my riding. It's been gone since the early 1990s. We used to have tens of thousands of good jobs along what was called the Golden Mile, Mr. Speaker, which when it opened after the Second World War was the model on which many communities ended up being built, because you could live and work close together and also have really good paying jobs, Mr. Speaker. But they're all gone, and they've been replaced by part-time, precarious, largely retail jobs and car malls, Mr. Speaker, that are not very accessible by transit, that don't make good planning for those areas. So, I mean, who are these changes being made for? Of course, I've said it's for the wealthy few. Just like the income splitting plan, Mr. Speaker, a $2.5 billion waste of our money that could be far better spent either on actually balancing the budget so that you don't have to dip into the contingency fund, or it could be spent on other programs like affordable childcare, Mr. Speaker. This government's entire package and plan for families, Mr. Speaker, will give families up to $1,960 a year per child. Well, in the City of Toronto, childcare costs are between $1,000 and $2,000 a month per child. So exactly what is the government telling families to do for the other 10 to 11 months beyond what their money gives? So, they give $1,960, but then families lose between $10,000 and $20,000 in childcare costs. So are families actually going to be further ahead at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker? No, they're not. They end up having to make really tough choices in our city of whether to lose one income and have one parent stay home, which puts a lot of strain on families, makes it hard to pay the mortgage, and God forbid if they're also trying to help a kid through university or college because of skyrocketing tuition fees, Mr. Speaker. So they want to give $1,960, but then let parents throw $15,000 to $20,000 a year in childcare costs. The NDP has an alternative plan of $15 a day for childcare, Mr. Speaker, that would actually be affordable for families, that would let them make the right choices for their families, whether to have a parent stay home or to have both parents work, because they would have the option to do either or. And it would be good quality childcare, Mr. Speaker. I know I started my working career in childcare. I worked at the Not Your Average Daycare in Scarborough for 5 years, Mr. Speaker, and I saw firsthand the importance of early education and learning, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the story doesn't end there. It gets worse. As we move forward through the years, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' plans and at the start cost but a few $100 million. A few $100 million primarily, of course, again, to the wealthiest Canadians. But the amazing thing, Mr. Speaker, is, of course, that this cost will grow and grow with each passing year. In a relatively short time, the cost of the Treasury, the cost to Canadians, to you and I, Mr. Speaker, will be $20 billion to the Treasury. Now, I heard one of the parliamentary secretaries say, yes, we don't want to pass on debt to the next generation, to our children, but they're doing something far worse. They're passing it to our children's children, Mr. Speaker. They're passing it to our grandchildren. And no responsible parent, grandparent, or frankly, government should ever pass the buck along 2 generations down the line. But of course, we've seen this approach with the government when we talk about climate change, Mr. Speaker, which wasn't even mentioned once in the budget. We see that they don't care. They have not put this as a priority. They say they're going to regulate sector by sector. But then the Prime Minister gets up and say, well, the biggest polluter, the biggest sector, oil and gas, we're not going to touch that, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this entire government's philosophy is relying on the high price of oil, Mr. Speaker, a commodity where the cost goes up and down, up and down. I worked in Fort McMurray. I worked in the oil sands. I've been there, and I've been there through one of those turns. The folks there know that it's cyclical. The casino in Fort McMurray is called Boomtown Casino because they know that the price of oil and the commodities goes boom or bust. But this government was relying on the fact that it was just going to boom forever, Mr. Speaker, and that's absolutely preposterous to rely on that kind of putting all your eggs in that one basket. You know, we all know that we're supposed to diversify the economy. We're supposed to invest in different areas of the economy so that we can weather those storms. But they never did that, Mr. Speaker. And now Canadians from coast to coast to coast are paying the price. And this budget should be helping people, but it's only helping the wealthy few, and the rest are left to fend for themselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his presentation. Again, the budget is extraordinary for what's left out. And I want to mention something so that Canadians will know, because I continue to be astonished by what's left out of the last number of years' budgets, and that is that they don't contain what I used to regard as the nuts and bolts of a budget. We used to have tables at the back of the budget that showed every department and showed what they were going to get in total to spend in the year, and compared it to the previous year and also rolled it out over a period of years coming. This budget doesn't include that, neither did last year's, so that, for instance, if you want to try to find out about international development assistance, another topic not mentioned in this budget, you can't find that department. Of course, the department is now folded into Foreign Affairs, but you can't find the Foreign Affairs budget in here either. You can't find Environment Canada's budget or Parks Canada's budget. There is actually no information about what each department of government will be allowed to spend and compared to other years. We have to wait for the main and supplementary estimates for that. And I wonder if my colleague has any comments on that.
Honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Well, my first comment would be, of course, what happened to that open and transparent government, Mr. Speaker, because what they've done is by removing these tables, by removing information, they make our jobs as Member of Parliament harder, but they also make it very, very difficult for Canadians to be able to actually see what is being spent and what's not being spent. And it's even more insidious than that, because what this does is it hides the money the government is spending, which means it gives ministers and it gives certain departments the ability to deliberately underspend their money. We just have to look at Veterans Affairs. Since this government took office, Mr. Speaker, instead of spending all the money they were allocated on veterans on improving their lives, they ended up returning billions of dollars to the Treasury, and that's shameful.
Questions and comments? Questions and commentaires?
The Honourable Member for Longueuil, Pierre Boucher. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. And I really appreciated the part where he was talking about how he's very familiar with daycare and that field and childcare, generally speaking, and that shows to what extent we have a plan, we're ready to go. The government has a bad plan that just helps out their friends. Like all Quebecers, I was disappointed with the lack of measures for culture and the environment in this budget. It's really distressing to see that there's nothing on that in this budget. And there comes a time when it's more than just a disappointment, it's very worrying when there's nothing on, for example, rail safety. And this is an important subject. I'd like to hear my colleague on that.
Southwest.
Bien sûr, et merci.
Indeed, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. And I'm somebody who loves taking the train, Mr. Speaker. When I was young, I took the train between Toronto and Montreal to visit family all the time. And I also spent several summers when I was young in Lac-Mégantic. That's where my family comes from. My grandmother was born there. My mother was born in Sherbrooke. And I can't tell you what impact that disaster personally had on me, to see what happened to that city because of cuts made by this government. 50 people were killed in that. That's something that can never happen again. And we really need to put rail safety, and as well as pipeline safety, road safety, and airline safety at the heart of our priorities so that we can prevent similar disasters in the future. Thank you.
We have time for one short question and response. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask my colleague opposite why he is so against tax-free savings accounts. Why is he against allowing Canadians to save for their futures, for their retirement, for their children's education? This is an opportunity to give Canadians that chance. 11 million accounts have already been opened. And my next question is also regarding his expensive bureaucratic child care program. How does he expect to pay for that? Will it be through a $20 billion carbon tax?
The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest. A short response, please.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, maybe he wasn't listening when I said that while 11 million accounts are open, only 11% of Canadians currently donate the maximum. And of course, we're not opposed to TFSAs. We're not going to get rid of them. We just don't want to put in the increase that they've put in, Mr. Speaker. And there are other investment opportunities for people to make if you're saving for your education. There's RESPs. If you're saving for your retirement or to buy your first home, there's RRSPs. So there are other avenues for Canadians, if they have extra money, to put them into there to change their taxes. This specific benefit that he's talking about is mostly going to go to wealthy Canadians that already have it easy. Why didn't they close the loopholes for CEO stock options that cost the Treasury $750 million? There's some of the money for our child care. Cancelling income splitting, there's $2.5 billion for child care. And actually increasing corporate taxes to the rate where they're paying their fair share, that'll pay for roads, that'll pay for transit, and that'll pay for child care, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate.